The ballroom doors split open like wounds, and the winter wind carried with it the scent of rain and ruin. Candlelight flickered across polished marble as guests turned their heads toward the sound of approaching footsteps. Footsteps that belonged to no one they recognized, yet somehow remembered from dreams they dared not speak of. In that moment, suspended between expectation and dread, she stood at the center of the gilded cage they called society, her heart hammering against ribs that felt too small to contain the storm brewing within. The silk of her gown whispered against her skin like a prayer she had never learned to speak, while 100 pairs of eyes measured her worth as if she were nothing more than currency in a transaction she had never agreed to make. Before we immerse ourselves in this story, leave your comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're joining us from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. The memory clung to her skin like dampness from a cellar that never saw sunlight. Cordelia pressed her palm against the cold stone of the servants' corridor, feeling the rough texture bite into her flesh as she tried to steady her breathing. 3 weeks had passed since Lord Ashworth announced her engagement to his nephew. 3 weeks of pretending gratitude while her soul withered like autumn leaves beneath carriage wheels. The walls around her held secrets older than her 17 years, whispers that seemed to seep from the very mortar between stones. She had grown up in these corridors, raised by housekeepers who spoke in hushed tones about the bastard daughter Lord Ashworth kept hidden like a shameful scar. Her mother's portrait hung in no gallery, her name appeared in no family record, yet Cordelia carried her beauty like a burden, the kind of ethereal loveliness that made men stare and women whisper behind gloved hands. Tonight, the engagement would be formally announced. Tonight. She would become the property of Edmund Ashworth, a man whose hands felt like dead fish against her skin, and whose laughter held no warmth. The thought made her stomach turn, but she had learned long ago that her desires mattered as little as morning mist against window glass. The grandfather clock in the main hall chimed 7 times, each note falling like a stone into still water. Cordelia closed her eyes and tried to summon the courage that had carried her mother through scandal and abandonment, but found only the hollow echo of resignation. Her fingers traced the outline of the locket at her throat, her only inheritance, a piece of tarnished silver that held no portrait, but somehow felt heavier than gold. The servant's bell rang, sharp and insistent, calling her to dress for the evening's performance. She straightened her shoulders and began the long walk toward the chamber where her wedding gown waited like a beautiful shroud, each step carrying her further from the girl she had been and closer to the woman she was expected to become. Through the narrow window at the corridor's end, storm clouds gathered against the twilight sky, and somewhere in a distance, thunder rolled like an ominous promise. The engagement party unfolded with the precision of a funeral march. Cordelia sat at the head table, her spine straight as a blade, while conversation flowed around her like water around a stone. Her betrothed, Edmund, regaled the guests with hunting stories that grew more elaborate with each glass of wine, his voice carrying the particular arrogance of men who had never known consequence. Lady Ashworth, resplendent in emerald silk and enough jewels to ransom a small kingdom, held court from her position at Edmund's right. Her eyes, cold as February mornings, swept over Cordelia with the same dismissive calculation one might give a piece of furniture that no longer matched the decor. The unspoken message was clear. You are here by sufferance, and sufferance can be withdrawn. "How fortunate Edmund is," Lady Margaret Thornfield remarked, her voice sweet as poisoned honey, "to have found such a suitable bride. I'm sure she'll adapt well to married life." The word suitable hung in the air like incense, cloying and inescapable. Cordelia's fingers tightened around her wineglass until her knuckles went white. She had perfected the art of silence over the years, learned to swallow words that might cut too deep or reveal too much. But tonight, surrounded by these gilded vultures picking at the bones of her future, something dangerous stirred in her chest. "Cordelia has such interesting features," continued Miss Beatrice Ashworth, Edmund's sister, her fan fluttering like a nervous bird. "So exotic. I wonder from which side of her family she inherited them." The question was a blade wrapped in silk, designed to draw blood while maintaining the pretense of politeness. The room fell silent except for the steady tick of the grandfather clock and the whisper of flames in the massive fireplace. All eyes turned to Cordelia, waiting for her response, hungry for her humiliation. She could feel the weight of their expectation, the collective breath held in anticipation of her discomfort. Before she could speak, a sound cut through the silence. Footsteps in the entrance hall, measured and deliberate, carrying an authority that made the very air seem to thicken. The great doors opened without announcement, without fanfare, and a figure stepped into the golden light of the ballroom like night incarnate. The stranger was tall, his form wrapped in a black coat that seemed to absorb the candlelight rather than reflect it. His hair was dark as midnight, and his skin held the pallor of someone who lived beyond the reach of common sun. But it was his eyes that stopped every conversation, every breath, every heartbeat in the room. Eyes the color of storm clouds, ancient and knowing, and utterly without fear. He moved through the assembled guests as if they were merely shadows, his gaze fixed on something beyond their understanding. The crowd parted before him like water before the prow of a ship, and in the wake of his passage, silence spread like ripples on a pond. When his eyes found hers across the room, Cordelia felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition that had nothing to do with memory and everything to do with destiny. The stranger's presence transformed the ballroom into something altogether different, a theater where familiar players suddenly forgot their lines. Lord Ashworth rose from his chair with the careful deliberation of a man who sensed the ground shifting beneath his feet. While Egmond's boisterous laughter died in his throat like a candle snuffed by wind. "I don't believe we've been introduced," Lord Ashworth said, his voice carrying the forced joviality of a host who has discovered an uninvited guest at his table. "I am Lord Ashworth, and this is a private celebration." The stranger's lips curved in what might have been a smile, if smiles could hold winter in their depths. "I am aware of what this is," he replied, his voice carrying an accent that seemed to belong to no particular region, yet felt older than the stones of the castle itself. "I am here to correct a mistake." Lady Ashworth's fan snapped shut with the sound of breaking bones. "Sir, I must insist." "You may insist on nothing." The words were spoken quietly, yet they carried the weight of avalanches. The stranger's gaze never left Cordelia, even as he addressed the room. "The girl belongs elsewhere." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Cordelia found herself rising from her chair without conscious thought, her body responding to something deeper than reason. The locket at her throat grew warm against her skin, as if responding to the stranger's presence. Edmund finally found his voice, though it emerged as more of a croak than the commanding tone he had cultivated. "See here, this woman is my betrothed. The contracts have been signed." Contracts! The stranger spoke the word as if it tasted of ash. Men and their papers, always believing they can bind what was never meant to be caged. He extended his hand toward Cordelia, palm up, fingers long and elegant as a pianist's. "Come." It was not a request. It was not a command. It was something else entirely. A recognition, an acknowledgement of a truth that had been waiting in the shadows of her life, like a secret she had forgotten she knew. The room erupted in protests, in demands for explanation, in threats both subtle and crude. But Cordelia heard none of it. She was walking toward the stranger as if in a dream, her feet moving across the polished marble with a certainty that belonged to someone braver than she had ever believed herself to be. When her fingers touched his, the world changed. The ballroom faded at the edges like a painting left too long in sunlight, and she could hear something calling from beyond the windows. Something wild and free and utterly without compromise. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the chaos erupting around them. His answer came like thunder across distant mountains. "I am what you have been waiting for." The touch of his hand sent lightning through her veins, a current that illuminated corners of her soul she had never known existed. Around them, the ballroom descended into pandemonium. Voices raised in outrage, chairs scraping against marble, the rustle of silk and the clink of crystal as guests rose from their seats in shock and indignation. But Cordelia heard only the thundering of her own heart and the stranger's voice, low and intimate despite the chaos surrounding them. "Your mother knew this day would come," he said, his thumb tracing across her knuckles with surprising gentleness. "She made me promise to find you when the time was right." The words hit her like cold water. "You knew my mother?" His smile held centuries of sorrow. "Isabella was remarkable. You have her eyes, the same fire that refuses to be extinguished, no matter how many try to snuff it out." Lord Ashworth's voice cut through their conversation like a blade. "Guards." "Seize this madman! He has no right!" "Rights!" The stranger's gaze shifted to Lord Ashworth, and the older man actually took a step backward. "You speak of rights while bartering away a soul that was never yours to sell." His attention returned to Cordelia, and his voice softened. "Your mother left you something more than that trinket around your neck. She left you a choice." The locket at her throat had grown warm enough to burn, the metal seeming to pulse with its own heartbeat. Cordelia's free hand moved to cover it, and the moment her fingers made contact, images flooded her mind. Her mother as a young woman, wild and beautiful and utterly unafraid, standing in a moonlit garden beside a man whose eyes held storms. "The choice is always yours," the stranger continued, his voice cutting through the visions like an anchor in turbulent seas. "But know that if you come with me, there will be no returning to this world of gilded cages and borrowed dreams." Edmund stepped forward, his face flushed with wine and wounded pride. "I will not stand for this mockery. The marriage contracts?" "Your contracts hold no power over what she truly is." The stranger's voice carried a note of finality that made the candle flames flicker. "She was never meant for your small world, Edmund Ashworth." Cordelia looked around the ballroom one last time, at the faces twisted with shock and fury, at the golden cage that had held her for 17 years, at the life that had been planned for her, like a dress tailored for someone else's body. Then she looked at the stranger's outstretched hand and saw not captivity, but freedom. "What is your name?" she asked. "Names have power," he replied. "When you are ready, you will know it." The decision formed in her chest like the first breath after drowning. "Then I choose the unknown." Din. The moment the words left her lips, the world seemed to exhale. The stranger's grip on her hand tightened, and together they moved toward the great doors as the ballroom erupted in a symphony of outrage behind them. Lord Ashworth shouted for his guards. Lady Ashworth shrieked about scandal and ruin, and Edmund's voice rose above them all, promising revenge and retribution. But their threats felt as distant as childhood nightmares to Cordelia now. Each step toward the door was a step away from the suffocating weight of expectations, away from a future that had been carved out for her like a tomb. The stranger moved beside her with the fluid grace of someone who had never learned to doubt their place in the world. And his presence made her feel, for the first time in her life, that she too belonged somewhere. The great doors closed behind them with a sound like thunder, muffling the chaos within. Outside, the storm that had been threatening all evening had finally broken, sending rain against the windows in sheets and setting the bare branches of ancient oaks to dancing in the wind. A carriage waited in the circular drive, black as midnight and drawn by horses that seemed carved from shadow itself. The driver was a figure, hunched in a heavy cloak, his face invisible beneath a wide-brimmed hat that shed water like scales. "Where are we going?" Cordelia asked as the stranger handed her up into the carriage's dark interior. "Home," he replied simply, settling beside her on the velvet-cushioned seat. "To the place your mother should have taken you long ago, before fear made her choose safety over truth." The carriage began to move, wheels cutting through puddles that reflected the lightning-split sky. Cordelia pressed her face to the rain-streaked window and watched Lord Ashworth's manor grow smaller and smaller until it was nothing more than a collection of golden squares against the darkness. "Tell me about her," she said softly. "Tell me about my mother." The stranger was quiet for a long moment, his profile etched against the storm-dark window. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of memory. Isabella was the daughter of a merchant family, respectable. But not nobility. She came to work in Lord Ashworth's household as a governess when she was barely 18, beautiful and brilliant and utterly unaware of her own power. Thunder rolled across the sky, and the carriage rocked gently as it navigated the winding country road. What kind of power? "The kind that runs in bloodlines older than human memory," he replied, his fingers tracing patterns on the fogged glass. "The kind that makes men write songs and start wars and abandon everything they thought they knew about the world." Cordelia's hand moved to the locket at her throat, feeling its warmth pulse like a second heartbeat. "And my father?" The stranger's smile was soft and sad. "A man who loved her more than his own soul, but not enough to defy the world for her sake." The carriage traveled through the night like a ship navigating dark waters, carrying them away from everything Cordelia had known toward something that felt like destiny. The stranger, who had told her to call him Nathaniel when she pressed for some name to anchor their conversation, spoke in measured tones about her mother's life before shame and scandal had driven her into hiding. Isabella possessed what our kind call the sight, he explained as the carriage wound through a forest where the trees seemed to lean in like curious listeners. She could see the threads that connect all living things, could sense the patterns that govern fate itself. It made her invaluable to those who knew what she was and dangerous to those who feared it. Our kind? Cordelia's voice was barely a whisper, afraid that speaking too loudly might shatter whatever spell was allowing her to hear these impossible truths. Nathaniel's eyes reflected the occasional flash of lightning, like mirrors in a haunted house. We are the children of two worlds, the daylight realm where humans build their castles and count their coins, and the deeper realm where older powers still hold sway. Most live their entire lives without ever knowing which world they truly belong to. The locket at her throat grew warmer, and suddenly Cordelia could see things in the darkness beyond the carriage windows, shapes moving between the trees that weren't quite human, eyes that glowed like amber in the shadows. The forest began to thin, and ahead of them, perched on a cliff overlooking a wild stretch of coastline, stood a structure that defied easy description. It was part castle, part cathedral, part something else entirely, its towers reaching toward the storm-dark sky like fingers grasping for lightning. Lights flickered in its windows, warm and golden and utterly welcoming despite the building's imposing presence. "Welcome to Ravens Hollow," Nathaniel said as the carriage began its ascent up the winding cliff road, the last sanctuary for those who carry the old blood. As they drew closer, Cordelia could see figures moving on the battlements, tall, elegant forms that seemed to glide rather than walk. Some had the pale, ethereal beauty she associated with stories of fairy folk, while others possessed a darker, more primal magnetism that made her heart race. "What am I becoming?" she asked, her voice small in the vastness of the carriage. Nathaniel's hand covered hers, warm and steady and infinitely reassuring. "You are becoming what you were always meant to be, free." Ravens Hollow's great hall was unlike anything Cordelia had ever imagined. The vaulted ceiling disappeared into shadows that seemed to move with their own life, while massive fireplaces cast dancing light across tapestries that depicted scenes of impossible beauty, forests where the trees bore silver fruit, oceans where merfolk danced beneath aurora-painted skies, mountains where dragons soared on wings of starlight. The inhabitants of this strange sanctuary moved with the fluid grace Cordelia had noticed from the carriage, and she realized with a start that they were all beautiful in ways that seemed to transcend mere physical perfection. There was something luminous about them, as if each carried a spark of some divine fire beneath their skin. "Lady Cordelia," a woman approached them, her voice like silver bells in a gentle wind. She appeared to be in her 30s, with auburn hair that seemed to hold flecks of gold, and eyes the color of deep forest pools. "I am Elena Ravencrest, mistress of this house. We have been expecting you." Cordelia found herself curtsying automatically. Though something in Elena's manner suggested such formalities were unnecessary here. "Expecting me?" "Your mother wrote to us before your birth," Elena explained, leading them toward a sitting area where a fire crackled merrily in a hearth large enough to roast an ox. "She knew that one day you would need sanctuary, and she wanted to ensure you would have a place among your own kind." The warmth of the fire felt like an embrace after the cold rain outside, and Cordelia settled into a chair upholstered in midnight blue velvet that seemed to mold itself to her form. Around the hall, other residents of Ravens Hollow went about their evening activities, some reading from books bound in what looked like scales. Others engaged in conversations that occasionally included words in languages she didn't recognize, but somehow understood. "Tell me about this place," Cordelia said, accepting a cup of something worn and spiced that Elena offered from a silver service. "Raven's Hollow has existed for over 1,000 years, Elena began, settling into the chair across from her. It was founded as a refuge for those who carry the blood of the Fae, humans whose lineages touched the ancient courts in the days when the barriers between worlds were thinner. Nathaniel had taken a position by the fire, his dark coat steam-dried by the flame's warmth. The gift manifests differently in each bloodline, he added. Some, like your mother, develop the sight. Others can speak with animals, or heal with their touch, or command the elements themselves. And you? Cordelia asked, studying his profile in the firelight. What can you do? His smile was enigmatic. I am what your kind might call a guardian. I exist to protect those who cannot yet protect themselves, to guide them safely between worlds. Elena leaned forward, her expression growing serious. The awakening of your gifts will not go unnoticed, child. There are those in both the human and Fae realms who would use such power for their own ends. Here, you will learn to control what you are becoming, to shield yourself from those who would exploit you. As if summoned by her words, a commotion arose near the hall's main entrance. The great doors burst open, admitting a figure in rain-soaked traveling clothes whose face bore the grim satisfaction of a messenger bearing urgent news. "My lady," the newcomer called to Elena, bowing low despite his obvious exhaustion. "Lord Ashworth has sent riders. They are asking questions in the villages, offering gold for information about a girl matching Lady Cordelia's description." The warmth of the fire suddenly felt very far away. Anonymous presence cast a shadow over the golden warmth of Raven's Hollow's great hall. Elena's expression hardened like marble, while Nathaniel moved away from the fire with the predatory grace of a wolf sensing danger. "How many riders?" Elena asked, her voice carrying an authority that made it clear she was far more than a simple hostess. "A dozen, my lady, led by Edmund Ashworth himself," the messenger replied. Water still dripping from his cloak onto the ancient stone floor. "They carry papers claiming the girl was abducted against her will and promising significant reward for her return." Cordelia's cup rattled against its saucer as her hands began to tremble. The brief illusion of safety that Raven's Hollow had provided suddenly felt as fragile as morning frost. "They'll never stop looking for me," she whispered. "Lord Ashworth's pride won't allow it, and Edmund sees me as property that's been stolen from him." "No one takes anything from Raven's Hollow without paying a price," Elena said firmly, rising from her chair with fluid grace. "But you're right that they won't abandon their pursuit easily. The human world has its own laws, and they will use them to justify their hunt." Nathaniel turned from where he had been studying the rain-lashed windows. "There is another way," he said quietly, his voice carrying undertones that made the fire flicker. "But it would mean crossing fully into our world, leaving your human life behind forever." The weight of his words settled over the room like a burial shroud. Cordelia felt the locket at her throat pulse with warmth, and suddenly she could hear something calling to her from beyond the storm. A voice that might have been her mother's, or the wind, or something deeper than either. What would that mean? She asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Elena and Nathaniel exchanged a look that carried centuries of shared understanding. "The crossing ritual," Elena said finally. "It's ancient magic, older than human memory. It would awaken your Fae blood completely, grant you power to protect yourself, But, she paused, choosing her words carefully. Once it's done, you can never return to what you were. Your human life would be over forever. Thunder crashed overhead, and in the distance, Cordelia could hear something that might have been hoofbeats, or might have been her own heart pounding against her ribs. The choice before her felt immense, final. A door that once opened could never be closed again. "How long do I have to decide?" she asked. Nathaniel moved to the window, peering out into the storm-dark night. "They're moving fast, but the weather will slow them. Perhaps until dawn." Cordelia closed her eyes, feeling the weight of two lives pressing down on her, the safe, constrained existence she had known, and the wild, dangerous freedom that beckoned from beyond. When she opened them again, her decision was clear in their depths. "Tell me about the ritual." Elena led them through corridors that seemed to exist in defiance of architectural logic, stairs that spiraled both up and down simultaneously, and doorways that opened onto rooms larger than the spaces that contained them. At the heart of Ravenshollow lay a chamber that took Cordelia's breath away, a circular room with walls of translucent crystal that showed not the storm outside, but glimpses of other realms entirely. "The Heart Chamber," Elena announced, her voice carrying a reverence that made Cordelia's skin prickle with awareness. "This is where the boundaries between worlds grow thin, where transformation becomes possible." The floor was inlaid with symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly, while overhead, the crystal dome revealed a sky full of stars that moved in patterns no human astronomer had ever charted. At the room's center stood an altar of black stone, its surface carved with runes that glowed with their own internal light. "The crossing ritual has been performed only 13 times in Ravenshallow's history," Elena explained, moving to light candles that had been placed at specific points around the circle. "Each time, it has fundamentally changed not just the individual, but the very fabric of both worlds." Nathaniel stood at the chamber's edge, his expression unreadable. "The process is intense," he said carefully. "You will experience every emotion your human ancestors ever felt, every memory your Fey lineage carries. Some minds break under the strain." Cordelia moved toward the altar, drawn by forces she couldn't name. The locket at her throat had grown so warm it was almost uncomfortable, and she could swear she heard whispers emanating from the crystal walls, voices speaking in languages that predated human civilization. "What happens if it works?" she asked, her fingertips trailing across the altar's carved surface. "You become something new," Elena replied. "Not fully human, not fully Fey, but a bridge between both worlds. You would possess power enough to protect yourself from any mortal pursuit, strength to carve your own destiny from the raw stuff of reality itself." A sound echoed through the chamber, distant but unmistakable. Hoofbeats on stone, growing closer. "They found us," Nathaniel said grimly. "The wards around Ravenshollow will slow them, confuse their senses. But Edmund Ashworth has hired trackers who know something of the old ways." Elena's expression hardened. "Then we're out of time for gentle contemplation." She turned to Cordelia, with eyes that blazed like silver fire. "Child, if you're going to do this, it must be now." Cordelia's hand moved to the clasp of her locket, and as the ancient silver opened, light poured forth. Not the pale glow of candle flame, but something fierce and wild and utterly alive. Inside, where she had expected to find a portrait or a keepsake, lay a single crystal that pulsed like a captured star. "Your mother's last gift," Nathaniel breathed. "A fragment of pure Fey essence, waiting for this moment." The sound of voices carried through the corridors now, harsh and demanding. Edmund's voice rose above the others. "Search every room! She's here somewhere!" Cordelia lifted the crystal from its silver nest, and the moment it touched her palm, the world exploded into color and sensation and memory that was not her own. She was falling and flying simultaneously, drowning in starlight and breathing liquid music. And then, with a sound like reality tearing, the transformation began. The crystal dissolved into her bloodstream like liquid starlight. And Cordelia's world became a kaleidoscope of sensation that threatened to tear her consciousness apart. She was simultaneously herself and everyone who had ever carried Fey blood in their veins. She could feel her mother's terror on the night she chose safety over love, could experience the wild joy of ancestors who had danced with dragons under alien moons. Her body, the locket around her neck, grew blazing hot, its silver beginning to melt and flow like mercury, forming new patterns on her skin, intricate spirals and knots that glowed with their own inner fire. Through the chaos of transformation, she could hear the sounds of Ravenshallow's defenders moving to confront the intruders. Edmund's voice echoed through the corridors, growing closer and more desperate. "I know she's here. I can feel it." Elena's hands pressed against Cordelia's shoulders, angering her to consciousness as the ritual behind him crowded a dozen armed men whose eyes held the hard gleam of those who would do anything for enough gold. "Stop this madness," Edmund roared, striding into the chamber despite the supernatural cold that poured from the crystal walls. "I don't know what devilry you're working here, but I won't let you corrupt her further." Nathaniel moved to intercept him, but Edmund had brought more than mortal men with him. One of his companions wore robes marked with symbols that made the air itself recoil, and when he raised his hands, binding spells crackled through the chamber like chains made of shadow. "A blood mage," Elena hissed, her own power rising in response. "He's trying to disrupt the ritual." The transformation was at its most delicate point, Cordelia suspended between two forms of existence, like a butterfly emerging from its chrysalis. The mage's interference sent waves of agony through her changing body, threatening to lock her forever in a state between human and Fey, alive but never whole. "Please," Edmund said, his voice breaking as he saw her writhing on the altar. Despite everything, despite the engagement she had never wanted and the future he represented, there was genuine pain in his eyes. "Come back to me, Cordelia. We can have a good life together. I can protect you from all this." She looked at him through eyes that now burned with starfire, and for a moment she almost pitied him. He was offering her the safety of a cage, the security of chains, everything she had been raised to want. But she had tasted freedom now, had felt the wild song of her Fey blood awakening, and there could be no retreat. "I was never yours to protect," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the crystal walls sing in response. With those words, the transformation completed itself in a burst of light that illuminated every corner of Ravenshallow. And Cordelia rose from the altar as something magnificent and terrible and utterly her own. If this story found a mirror in your soul, leave your comment and share. Sometimes what hurts within us is what makes us most human.